The content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, sensitive topics, and explicit language that may be triggering, offensive, or sensitive subjects to some viewers and listeners. Discretion is advised. The purpose of this podcast is to explore and discuss true crime cases for entertainment and educational purposes only. This podcast does not intend to glorify or sensationalize crime, but rather aims to analyze and understand the complexities of human behavior in the criminal justice system. We encourage listeners to approach this content with empathy, critical thinking, respect for the victims and their families. Imagine being at the pinnacle of a promising medical career only to find yourself entangled in a web of addiction, betrayal, and a fight for redemption. Tonight, we'll explore the dark underbelly of the opioid crisis and uncover the stark realities of addiction, the devastating consequences, and the ethical lapses in the medical profession that feed this hidden plague in America. Prescription for Pain, How a Once Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Killer, with author Philip Isle. This groundbreaking book is based on 12 years of correspondence, interviews with Volkman. Isle also traveled to 19 states, interviewed more than 150 people, and filed Freedom of Information Act lawsuits against the Drug Enforcement Administration that led to the release of nearly 20,000 pages of trial evidence. Philip Isle is an award-winning freelance journalist and is based in his hometown, Providence, Rhode Island. It's time to start the show. Let's hit it. Hi, I'm Winnie Schrader, and welcome to another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. Well, tonight I wanted to talk to somebody who, I guess, kind of had their fingers in the opioid epidemic when it started back in 1996. This has been an epidemic beyond proportions for too long, really. I've had many friends and even some family members die because of opioids. And I think it's a very important topic that we need to address. So I have Philip Isle, who wrote the book Prescription for Pain, How a Once Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Doctor. Hi, Philip. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Winnie. Thanks so much for having me.
So I kind of looked at, so you knew the doctor that became known as the Pill Mill Doctor. Your father went to school with him. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I didn't know Paul Volkman. First off, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here. I didn't know Paul Volkman growing up. He was not somebody who came over to our house or we went on family vacations together. But I learned eventually that he and my dad, who is still a practicing doctor here in Rhode Island and Massachusetts nearby where we live, they had gone to college and medical school together. And they had fallen out of touch for a number of decades. And then my dad heard from this old classmate of his in 2008 when Paul's wife passed away. He asked if my parents would attend the funeral. And they went out to Chicago. They hadn't heard from this guy in a while. It was a bit of an odd, out of the blue phone call, but they thought it was the right thing to do. And when they went out to Chicago, they learned that Paul was under federal indictment for prescription drug dealing. This was in 2007. He had been indicted. The wife's funeral was in 2008. About a year passes, and my parents were talking about this odd trip that they had and this surprise of learning about this guy's really astonishing legal situation. At the time he was under indictment, he wouldn't go to trial for a couple more years. And when I heard about this was 15 years ago. I was just starting out as a journalist. I had recently read In Cold Blood. I was ambitious and had a lot of energy and had those antennae that all journalists have of always, being on the lookout for a story. And I thought, what on earth happened to this guy? He was a high school valedictorian. He has an MD, PhD from the University of Chicago. By all accounts, he was a highly intelligent guy. And yet the story of his career and his life kind of goes dark, at least from my dad's perspective and from my perspective early on, for those 30 some odd years between their graduation from medical school in the mid 70s to Volkmann's indictment. So it was that mystery of how on earth does a guy find himself in this astonishing situation? And then later on, he was convicted and sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms in prison, which there have been dozens of doctors who have been charged and convicted with drug dealing during the opioid epidemic, but none of them have sentences that match or exceed 4 life terms. So my story, this book, really started out with that mystery of what happened to this guy. And that's the story I wound up telling.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that did happen to a lot of doctors during, late 90s when Purdue started pushing out the Oxycontin pill. The way they make it sounds like it's like this strip club mentality where you had these hot little sales reps going to these doctors' offices trying to push this pill and giving these doctors perks. And I can see where the Hippocratic Oath starts to become gray, because you're seeing, to me, it seems like everything boils down to the almighty dollar when it comes to the opioid epidemic. Who's making the dough? And, it's unfortunate that somebody, a promising doctor like this, can fall so far from why he even became a doctor in the first place. It's very sad. So obviously he was a doctor, a likable doctor. He had, great credibility until the opioid was introduced. So where from when he graduated and to where he started his downfall, was there something in between there that caused him to turn that way?
Well, so I didn't know to start, but what I found over years of research and interviewing Volkmann, but also interviewing a lot of other people and tracking down literally thousands of pages of court transcripts, is that what we might call his downfall had in fact started many years earlier. And it started with a number of malpractice cases against him. Now, these were not criminal cases, but they were civil lawsuits. There were a number of them, 4 of which were ultimately either settled against him by insurance companies or verdicts against him after trials. So I'll get into Volkmann's odd career a little bit. So he and my dad get their MD PhDs at the University of Chicago. Neither of them are really trained to see patients. They're trained to be researchers, who are the people who look into illnesses and medications and then publish in journals. And that is how the kind of medical field progresses. Both would wind up seeing patients for different reasons. Volkmann started out in research and kind of flamed out from that. He says it was a lab director he was working for who wouldn't allow him to publish research that he says was brilliant and revolutionary. I talked to that lab director and I got a very different story. That was a theme in this book, is Volkmann said one thing that often made him look heroic or brilliant or, any number of other praiseworthy things. And I would talk to other people that said, gave quite a different impression. So Volkmann then goes into pediatrics pretty early after medical school. That was a move that didn't really make a lot of sense to the people around him. He didn't seem like the personality who would be cut out for that. It also didn't make a lot of financial sense. Pretty early on in his pediatrics career, this is all in Chicago, he starts working in emergency rooms, first on nights and weekends in Chicago. And then later on, he starts taking temporary positions called locum tenens work, is kind of the official word for temp work for doctors, in hospitals around the Midwest, ultimately in about 6 states in the Midwest. And over 20 years of working in pediatrics and emergency medicine, he faces those lawsuits, one of which involves the death of a pediatrics patient. Others involve really catastrophic injuries with the patients involved. Volkmann claims that he's didn't do anything wrong in any of them, that it was unscrupulous lawyers or patients looking for a payout. The records from those cases and the people close to those cases tell a quite different story. And then the really key turning point took place in the early 2000s when Volkman found himself unable to access medical malpractice insurance. Now, most places where you could work as a doctor will require that insurance. And so he found that his opportunities for employment as a doctor were severely limited. And he, at that point, was living on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, a ritzy part of town, with a rent that was about $4,500, right on Lake Michigan, doorman building. And he was really desperate. And he found an advertisement for a clinic down in Southern Ohio in the Appalachian part of the state, right near Kentucky and West Virginia. This clinic didn't require malpractice insurance. And as he would later find out, it accepted only cash and was known for high prescriptions of opiates and other controlled substances. And so he started commuting down there for a work week and then flying back. And he did this for almost 3 years. And this was where, according to investigators, he really stepped over that line into drug dealing.
Okay. Now, did any of his patients, when he started pumping out these pills to the patients, were any of the charges that brought it up to him, were any of them like manslaughter or any type of thing like that? Because, I mean, I don't know how they would kind of tie a doctor to a death of a pill. I don't know how they would do that. So is there a way, is something happened with his case that they kind of tied him to some deaths just to kind of make it stick a little better for him?
So that was, the nature of this case, charging a doctor with drug dealing, charging a doctor with being responsible for patient deaths. It's complicated stuff. It's not like, let's say, a violent crime where a person stabs or shoots someone. There's a lot of gray area there, and I found that really interesting. And that was one of the many reasons it took me a long time to complete this book, was kind of digging through the complexity of that. Mind you, this whole time, Volkman maintained his innocence, and he still maintains his innocence from prison. So that was in the front of my mind, that here's this guy who's very bright, highly qualified, stating that he was innocent. What he was charged with was prescription drug dealing. Basically, at the federal level, medications like oxycodone and Valium and muscle relaxers are regulated by something called the Controlled Substances Act. And any doctor who is going to prescribe those things needs an active registration number with the DEA. So, and if they write a prescription for oxycodone or for Percocet and one of these controlled substances, they need to put their number on the prescription slip. And one of the requirements for doing that is that you are prescribing these medications. The statute is something like for legitimate purpose and in the course of legitimate medical practice. So it hinges on this subjective word legitimate. So when the government wants to argue that you are actually a drug dealer, they set out to argue and present evidence that your business, your medical operations are illegitimate. And that's what they ultimately accused Volkman of. They didn't charge him with manslaughter or murder. They charged him with prescription drug dealing with death or injury resulting. So it was really a drug dealing case with what they said were fatal consequences.
Wow. I know. And it's like, I watched one of the series. If any of you guys listeners, if this is so interesting, you watch Dope Sick on Hulu. Did you watch Dope Sick? I thought it was very brilliant how they did that. And then they also had another one, I think it was called Painkiller. It kind of showed the duality of the prescription sales reps. And then the other one, Dope Sick, is more of the doctors, how they were struggling once they started prescribing this medication. And of course, Purdue is like, this is non-addictive. It's safe. FDA approved it. And then they kept upping the doses of these, first it was 10 milligrams. Now you can get up to 160 milligrams, I believe now, of Oxycontin. But it showed the duality of both sides and how doctors were struggling. And some doctors were ethical. They're like, no, my patient can take ibuprofen. I'm not giving my patient that. But yeah, it just kind of with that... It's sad because it's just like you see you see the destruction of a whole society of just a little pill, and knowing that the money, you have to follow the money and the corruption that it caused, and seeing a lot of good doctors go down, and you doing your research. Has there been a type of new legislation to kind of make it, I don't know, is it still an issue with doctors, or are more people getting this on the streets?
So at this point in 2024, we are in, what the CDC points to is kind of a third awful phase of the opiate epidemic. It started with prescription drugs, and then OxyContin really was the main one that kind of kicked this whole thing off for some of the reasons you describe, and for in ways that shows like Dope Sick on Hulu and Painkiller on Netflix portray. Then I think as the result of a lot of the crackdown on prescribing and pain clinics, the supply of those pills was lowered, and then a prescription drug addiction epidemic turned into a heroin epidemic, and then the heroin epidemic gave way to what we're now in, which is this awful, highly lethal fentanyl epidemic. And in terms of the legislation, so in that sense, prescription drugs were, I think, what really got this awful thing rolling. And now it has its own terrible momentum. And we just see these, states where I live, Rhode Island, really any state in this country, you just see horrifying annual, monthly death tolls from overdoses. So this is an Ohio story. Volkman was living in Chicago, but these clinics where he was working were down in the southern part of Ohio, in an Appalachian part of the state, a place that had been really poor for a while, used to have factories, but those were kind of long gone by the time he arrived. And one of the things I tracked over the course of my reporting, one of the benefits of working on a story for more than a decade is you can follow this stuff, is on the city level, they cracked down eventually on pain clinics like this, cash-only pain clinics that weren't affiliated with local hospitals, that often were owned by people who had no medical background. All of those things apply to Volkman's clinics. And you also saw at the state level, a number of states, including Ohio, passed laws. The one in Ohio was kind of colloquially called the Pill Mill Bill, that made it a lot harder for clinics like this to operate, really closed up a lot of the loopholes that clinics like this used to stay in business for a while and to make a lot of money.
Oh, good. Yeah. Cause I was just going to say, have we learned anything from his case? Like, what's the next phase to crack down on this? Because obviously criminals are going to find a way around anything. So it's like, okay, so what's the next phase that we have to combat this? And I mean, it was sad. Like, I watched documentaries on this. They were taking people by bus to all these cash only pain clinics so they could scrounge up all the pills and then they would go and sell them. So like they were just doctor shopping to all these cash only clinics, and they had groups of people doing it in buses. I mean, it's bad. And
yeah, one place where you heard a lot about pain clinics was Florida. The problem was really bad down there. But another place was in this part of Ohio and across the river in Kentucky. Paul Volkman claimed, and he spoke to me for many hours in his apartment in Chicago about how innocent he was and all of the rules he practiced under, supposedly, and the precautionary measures he took. But when you went down to this part of the state of Ohio, which I found in my research, even in the year that he arrived in 2003, this place had already had the nickname the OxyContin capital of the world. Yep. This was a place that had a serious problem with sketchy pain clinics, with doctors prescribing large amounts of pain pills, with doctors getting charged and convicted and hauled off to prison. This problem preceded Paul Volkman, and it continued after him. So when you go down there and you ask people, is it possible if this guy was doing the right thing, as he claims, very, very few, if any, people believe it. They say, no, we've seen this many times, and these guys were corrupt.
Yeah, I've actually been in that part of town or part of the country many times. And yeah, they're blue collar people. They're coal miners. It's a coal miner town. You have a lot of industrial type jobs. A lot of people get hurt, have injuries, and they just I think that area was targeted for that reason, and it has completely kind of destroyed communities. And a lot of communities are still trying to rebuild. A lot of companies have moved out of there. There's a lot of places that don't even have jobs anymore in the area. But yeah, I know exactly what you mean, targeting those low income, hardworking people, and to just throw this magic pill and say you can work like you were 20 again. Well, of
Yeah.
course they're going to get addicted to it.
What's that?
Of course they're going to get addicted to it because it's such a highly addictive medication. And when your doctors are prescribing it for a hangnail, it's a problem.
Yeah, I went to Portsmouth, Ohio, which was where most of his criminal activity took place. Many times I really developed a soft spot for the place. And they were near coal country, but there used to be a booming manufacturing. This was decades before Volkman arrived. This was a town where they made bricks, where they made steel, where they made shoes. It's really kind of where the Rust Belt and Appalachia overlap. And but by the time that he arrived and by the time these clinics moved in, those jobs were long gone. And it was a place that had been struggling that kind of fell even further as a result of this stuff. If you go down there, you mentioned at the top of the show how many people you know who have been affected by this. And I'm in a similar situation where I certainly know people who have been affected by this overdose addiction. But down in this part of the state of Ohio, it's overwhelming how many relatives people have, how many friends they have, how many high school classmates they've lost. It's just a real issue down there.
Right. And I mean, even there's been celebrities that have come out and talked about their opioid addiction, which I think is very important because it's, addiction is not racist. It's not sexist. It doesn't have a preference. And it can affect anybody and everybody from rich to poor to middle class to unemployed to employed. It doesn't matter. Matthew Perry is a perfect example. He has struggled with alcohol and pain pill addiction for many years. And, dealing with depression and everything, he was getting treated with ketamine. Special K, which is another highly addictive psychedelic medication, and mixing that with other type of medications. He passed away this year. Or was it last year? Oh my gosh. Matthew Perry, how long has it been? It's been like a couple months. Wow. But we still have to take a quick break. But when we come back, we're going to kind of conclude with Dr. Volkman. You said he still retains his innocence. Is he trying to appeal this and see if he can get out from underneath these charges? We'll talk about that when we take a quick break.
All right, my darklings. Summer is here, and the Paranormal 60 swag shop has all your supernatural summer must-haves. From comfortable and breathable tanks for both men and women, to a paranormal investigator's must-have, a Bluetooth speaker for those EVP burst sessions, or to just lay in a cemetery at night and listen to some heavy metal with your paranormal peak. And don't forget the Paranormal 60 sling bag, which you can put all your awesome paranormal investigating tools in it while you investigate. But don't forget to grab your Paranormal 60 travel mug. It's important to stay hydrated in those dank and damp hot places y'all investigate during the summer. So make sure you check out the swag shop. Just go to paranormal60.com, click the swag shop tab at the top of the page, and then just check out the Paranormal 60 podcast collection. Is where you can find all these supernatural summer must-haves. And remember, kids, stay spooky.
And we're back. Okay, so Dr. Volkman, is he going to try and start his appeal process?
Oh, he already has. He's well into that. So one of the things that made this case so interesting is I mentioned there have been dozens of doctors charged with prescription drug dealing over the course of the opioid epidemic. I'd say the majority of them were offered and accepted a plea deal, which meant that they would face less prison time, but there wouldn't be a trial. Volkman, who is a combative character, to say the least, refused to accept a plea deal. And so this case went to a trial in 2011 in federal court in Cincinnati, about 2 hours west of where the crimes took place. And as a result of that trial, where 70 witnesses were called for the prosecution, 10 for the defense, it was this mountain of information that I had access to that really helped me to tell this story. And he certainly got his day in court. He declined to testify, but his case, his defense lawyers presented 10 witnesses. Now, the jury really didn't buy that side of the story and convicted him on most of the things he was charged with. And they also had the option for the counts of the indictment that related to patient deaths. There were 13 of these. They had the option to, if they believed the evidence merited it, hold him directly responsible for a patient death. And in 4 cases, they did that. So when you hear that he is facing 4 consecutive life terms in prison, those life sentences connect to those patient deaths. Now, to your question, he has fought this conviction with every imaginable argument. He has filed appeals. He has filed motions for compassionate release, claiming that, his age and his health issues are a reason why he should be let out. He's tried to have the judge thrown off the case. He has thrown the kitchen sink at this conviction, sometimes with lawyers, sometimes on his own, and none of it has worked. And I suspect, so he's now been in prison since his conviction is 13 years, since his sentencing, 12 years. None of those attempts have worked. And I mean, obviously 4 consecutive life terms is not the kind of sentence that is just going to be easily tipped over. I imagine he's still trying. He was still filing motions the last time I checked, claiming he was a good doctor. I think it's quite unlikely he'll be successful in arguing his way out of prison, though.
Yeah, well, the only thing I could think of that he could possibly get out of jail if the Alford plea, but then he would have to say that he did it. And it seems like he's kind of stubborn and bullheaded. He won't admit that he did wrong.
And I doubt he's even being offered that. But anything that would involve admitting guilt, he won't do.
Yeah, it seems like
at least in my experience. Right.
Yeah, it sounds like from what you just said, he's in his mind, he's a good doctor. He did right by his patients. And
Winnie, not only would he claim he's a good doctor, he wrote a open letter from prison that was published on a website dedicated to doctors convicted of these crimes. And he said, I am the victim in this case. So that's the kind of person.
Okay. Tell that to the family members that had to bury their other family members because of you, dude. So it's like, you're the victim.
And to that point, I mean, even though Volkman was my entry point into the story, because I was fascinated by this connection he had with my dad, it was really the victims and their family members whose stories I wanted to really center in this book. And I went to great lengths to try to contact those family members, to include their stories, to include the fact that they really don't believe for a second this guy was legitimate. And I tried my best to honor the memories of those folks who lost their lives after going to these clinics, which meant not only describing, the circumstances they were going to the clinic under, but also just trying to describe them as people with hobbies and passions and careers and spouses and children and so on. That was really a priority for me.
Well, for my personal experience, my former nephew, when he was 3 years old or 9 years old, his mother died in a hotel room of a drug overdose. She was taking pain medication. She fell into a bonfire and got burned really bad. So she had a lot of nerve damage. So they prescribed her OxyContin, and her addiction grew and grew and grew to the point where on Christmas Eve, 15, 20 years ago, she went to bed and did not wake up. So I see the destruction just from one death, how many lives that one death was affected by because of a medication that I believe should be controlled in a clinical setting. If you need pain medication, you go to the clinic, you get an injection, you go home. type of thing. I don't think these substances should be in the hands of people because obviously people are not responsible enough to take these medications properly. And I'm hoping books like yours are going to shed light on this so we can have new legislation to protect people from becoming addicted to these substances to begin with. That's the problem. People get hurt, they get the pill, they get addicted, they need more.
Yeah, I mean, one of the complicated things is there is a real argument on the other side, at least in theory, of these medications can be really effective for treating some of the most intense pain. The book is not necessarily an anti-opiate book, but this was an era starting in the mid-90s, even earlier, when we had this huge cultural shift in the medical world and in society at large. And we now know that some of the motivations, a lot of the motivations for that shift were based in financial reasoning and not necessarily public health. And so the pendulum swung way in the direction of more liberal pain care, more liberal access to opiates. And we are still dealing with the consequences of that. So it is a balance. But I hope that, this book can help to inform that debate by offering a real story where too many people's lives were affected in the most awful ways.
Yes, and speaking of your book, I will have a link for the book in today's episode description, but please go out, Prescription for Pain, go out and get How Once a Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Killer. And please rate and review the book. It helps the authors for that book to get seen by more people and like-minded people like yourself who love true crime. So please rate and review and send me if you guys buy it and you like the book, let me know and I'll pass it along over to Philip too. Yes. I love
I love hearing from readers. To work on this for basically 15 years meant that I was carrying around this belief privately that this was a story worth telling. So when I do hear from people, whether I'm out at a bookstore or a library, or whether I'm, getting their DMs on social media or an email, I really cherish those interactions with readers because it's so rewarding for me to see people be interested in this story that I put so much work into.
Well, bless you for doing the work. It's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it, right?
Thank you so much, Winnie.
Yeah, I'll also put links today in the program guide for any type of drug addiction. If you guys need help with drug addiction, anything like that, I'll put some resources in the episode guide for you as well. Well, thank you so much, Philip. Now, this plague that has hit our country for over 30 years now needs to stop getting swept under the rug. Since 1999, now more than 760,000 people have died from opioid addiction since 1999. Nearly 75% of those overdose deaths were in 2020. It's still a problem, and it still needs to be addressed. The problem is a lot of these higher ups, these suits that sit behind a desk, and all they can do is count the money and not the pills. They look at these people as drug addicts, downtrodden, poor. Last time I checked, you guys were the drug dealers. So, that doesn't make you culpable? I think so, Purdue. I think so, Pfizer. It does. You guys are drug dealers, which is illegal. And you keep feeding these poisons to our communities, yet you just keep feeding the pill mill and giving these people narcotics that should be supervised by a medical professional, not in their kitchen cabinets or their bathroom cabinets, or crushed up on a table, snorted up their nose. Addiction isn't racist. It isn't sexist. It doesn't give a shit if you're poor, if you're rich. What matters is that we need to take this opioid crisis very seriously and start making legislation to protect patients and their communities so they do not get addicted to these medications anymore, that they are controlled and monitored. So that way they're not addicted and then going off into heroin or fentanyl or snorting shit up their nose that shouldn't even be consumed by the human body. And if you guys need help with addiction, please use the resource numbers that I have in the program guide today. It's okay. Don't feel ashamed. It doesn't matter if you're addicted. It happens. But if you need help, you need to reach out.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. And until our next case, my armchair detectives, stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay aware. I'll see you right here next week on Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot.